On Kuf Tesla Aleph, Kuf Tesla Base 109b, and we are at. Second. A little more than half the way down the page. First one in the line is Gufa. It's at that little star of the beginning of the line. Gufa Amr Menyumi Breder of Nechumi, or Menyumi the son of Nechumi said, "Ba'asr the shakal shasla palgo, the arisa tilsa." In a town where a sharecropper takes a third, and a shasla, the vineyard manager, takes half. Hi shasla, the boy is the luka. Yavina le shavche. Masakin lake. He lives at balabayas. So if the shasla decides to leave, we make sure that he gets his portion, his share, but only such that the owner or the landlord does not suffer any consequence. It's like we explained before yesterday. Let's say the field grew 90 units. So the owner would still get the same 40 net gain, the same 45 units. If he had the shasla in town, the shasla would take 45 and he would get 45. Now that the shasla is leaving, we give him 67 and a half, 22 and a half to go to pay for the oris, the sharecropper, to take care of his land, so that he has a net gain of 45. The remainder goes to the shasla. Omer Rav Menyumi Breder of Nechumi. Rav Menyumi, the son of Rav Nechumi, says, Kupa Sabo Palgo Shatfanohar Rivo. Okay, there's two types of damages. Let's say the vineyard gets old. Meaning the tree no longer is bearing fruit the same way it used to bear fruit. And because of that, they have to the shasla has to move to the side. It's not profitable for him to plant the tree. So then he takes half of the profits. However, shot for nohar, let's say there was a flood. And the flood is causing him to move, that he can't plant the vineyard for a very long time. So then Riva, he only gets a quarter. 1 second. Okay. A quarter, again, is the payment that a shasla gets for leaving before his time. Typically, a shasla would get, according to the final interpretation of the Gemara, a quarter actually means a real quarter, and doesn't mean a quarter that's really a sixth. A sixth, it means a quarter. And the reason why he would do this is because he's leaving. If he leaves on what's a normal, predictable schedule, like the tree's getting older, so then he's entitled to full compensation. But if he leaves because some event happens, he can't use the vineyard, so then he's only entitled to compensation that would leave the original owner with his full share, and that would be a quarter. Would go to the shasla. A fellow gave his property as collateral to his friend for 10 years. The kosh l'chamishnin. And after 5 years, the trees in the property got older and they weren't bearing fruit anymore. Abaya says, perahava. Abaya says that's fine. Okay, meaning I leased the field for 10 years, and I thought let's say it was an orchard. I thought I would get fruit for 10 years. Now, after 5 years, the trees are all dead, or they're old and they're not bearing fruit anymore. So according to Abaya, well, then I get the trees themselves. That's also the fruit of the tree. I could chop down the trees and use the wood. That's pera. That is the fruit of the tree. Rava says, no, karnahava, it is the principle of the tree. Okay, therefore, what do I do? If it's principle and I have to sell all the wood, and I buy another orchard with all the wood, all the money from the wood, and I can eat the fruits of the next orchard. Okay, so in other words, the debate here between Abaya and Rava is the wood of the trees after they get older, is that considered fruit, or is that considered principle? If it's principle, it has to be sold and transferred to a different orchard, which the owner of the collateral is able to enjoy to eat from. Okay. Meisvei, question. Yavesh ilon anitzatz. Let's say the trees dried up or they got chopped down. Shneim asurim bay. Okay, so this again is the same type of lease. The lease is a little bit like a loan. But because the trees were chopped down, the owner can't benefit from the trees because he promised them to the lessee. The lessee can't eat from the trees because they represent the actual property of the owner, and he's sort of burning through the property as opposed to using the property. You know, if you lease the property, you don't get to destroy things; you just get to enjoy the benefits. But by selling the wood or the trees that were chopped down, it goes far beyond using the benefits. Okay, so what do you do? So what do you do about it? You sell the trees you sell the value of the wood, and you purchase another orchard, and he gets the fruit of the orchard. My love, what's the scenario? When we talk about the tree drying up, we talk about it in the same way that we talk about the tree being chopped down. Presumably, it got chopped down because it was no longer bearing fruit. Uktani and the mission, meaning, and you know, trees get old, and at some point they're no longer fruit bearing, and that's what happened here. And yet, what's the law? You have to sell the tree. We don't say that you can eat the tree itself. You can eat the wood of the tree. You can enjoy it. We see clearly here that the tree is principal. That's why it's being sold, and the value being transferred to a different asset, whose benefit is going to the lessee, to the farmer. Oh, okay. This is a question on a bio. So the Gemara says no. It's not a loy nixes to me the yavish. My yavish below money. Af nixes below money. To the contrary, we're talking here about what happened as an unusual event. There was a sudden drought or a tremendous heat stroke, and it killed the tree. And similarly, when we talk about the tree being cut down, we don't mean that it was cut down because it was a hurricane. We mean to say that it was cut down, somebody cut it down before its time. It wasn't yet old enough to be chopped down. Okay, because all this happened before its time, it wasn't expected. So therefore, even Abaye agrees that in this case, it represents the principle and not the fruit. Abaye's argument is when the tree is chopped down in a predictable fashion because it got older and now it's dead, it doesn't bear fruit anymore. So that is predictable. Because it's predictable, that's what you're paying for in the original lease. You're paying to eat from the orchard until it dies, and then you get to chop down the trees and enjoy the woods. But if it got chopped down before its time, so then Abaye would agree that the tree represents the principal asset of what you're renting, and therefore you have to sell it and buy a different asset and enjoy the benefit of that asset. Okay, Toshma. Noflog fanim v'zeisim zikenim. So a married woman gets an inheritance with old vines. So what do I do with the old vines? You sell the vines, and he okay. So now the husband here, generally speaking, unless a prenup was specified otherwise, the husband gets to benefit from his wife's the assets his wife brings into the marriage. Similarly, if his wife inherits assets, the husband gets the benefit of it. But he does not have permission to destroy the principal. So the woman gets the field with the old vines. Are those vines principal or those vines fruit? So Gemara says they're principal. You have to sell the vines and then buy fruit. Buy a different property, another orchard, another set of vines, and then you can enjoy the benefit of those vines. Now, presumably, these aged out, in a time frame that you'd expect them to age out. And yet, the law is that we treat it as principal. We treat it as saying that you have to sell the property, keep the money, put the money invested into a new principal asset. And the husband can get the benefit of that new asset. Gemara says, Ema vihiskinu, meaning it aged rapidly in an unpredictable fashion. Because it aged so rapidly, so therefore we treat trees like principal. We treat it as if it was sudden damage, and therefore you sell it and buy a new asset. Another possibility is another possibility is that the trees actually are not even owned by her father. I'm sorry, the trees are owned by her father. The property is not owned by her father. So it's trees in somebody else's property. In that case, the trees are what we call kalya karna. As soon as the trees die, you have to remove it from the property and you don't get anything. So meaning there's no principle to remain. So therefore, when the trees die, you have to sell the trees and buy a new asset. So at least you have a new principal asset. And you don't destroy, the man doesn't destroy his wife's assets. Okay, next Gemara. Okay, now a few interesting discussions about who's believed when and sort of the order of the law. There was a document that said that it was a lease, and it said for a few years. It didn't specify how many. Malva, the lender argues, Sholosh, it's 3 years. Loivamar, but the borrower says, no, it's Shtayim, it's 2. So now what's the deal? So what happened? The borrower was on the property for 2 years. The 3rd year, he didn't go to court. He just stayed there. And he ate another year worth of fruit. And now the lender is at the end of the year, he's like, 1 second, you're only supposed to be here for 2 years. I want you to pay me back for that year that you ate on my property. Minaman, who's believed? The lender for eating that extra year, or the borrower who says, no, you only had 2 years? Rabbi Yehudah says, the property remains with the presumption of the owner of it. Who's the owner? The borrower. So the borrower has the presumption of being correct, unless it's the lender's responsibility to prove him wrong. However, if Kahana says no, the fruit has the presumption of being the one with the one who ate it. The lender ate the fruit. The lender has the presumption of being the owner here. And because the lender has the presumption of being correct, it's the borrower's obligation to prove him wrong. The halacha is the halacha follows the opinion of Rav Kahana. The Omar Peres becheskas echlei and ekaimi, that the fruit remains in the with the presumption of ownership of the one who ate them, i.e., the lender. It's the borrower's obligation to prove the lender wrong. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? 1 second, didn't we learn that the law follows Rav Nachman, that typically the presumption of a property follows the property's owners? Okay, if the money follows the owners of the property, then the owner of the property here is the borrower. So the lender ate an extra year. Well, it's his the burden of proof is on him, because the presumption here is with the owner of the property, because that's the halacha. Why is this scenario different? That the law over here is the presumption is with the guy who ate the fruit, as opposed to the general rule, which is the guy who owns the property. So the Gemara answers, Hasa milsa le'avidu le'glui. That the le'avidu le'glui. Hacha milsa le'avidu le'glui. Ashur chibiyah tracy ya. Loy mitra matarchinan. Okay, meaning that generally speaking, while generally speaking, it is true that the presumption of ownership goes to the owner of the property. That would be the borrower in this case. But this case is different. Why? Because the number of years is probably something that will be discovered. And we're not going to have a court be involved here twice. Once because we have the presumption of the owner, which would be that of the borrower, and a second time potentially later on when the lender comes to prove that actually he did have control for 3 years, because we presume that that the actual length of the contract will be revealed. So we tell the court to stay hands off until we figure out the actual answer to the question. Then the court will go in and potentially interfere if necessary. Okay, next scenario. Okay, a little bit of an introduction before we begin, which is that the general rule of the property title ownership thing is a little bit different than we have today. Nobody could afford, no government could afford to pay people to sit in air-conditioned offices with a bunch of papers in a room and declare who has title. So the system worked something like this. You bought a field, you were obligated to retain documentation for 3 years. And that 3 years is 3 years of living on the property, doing what you normally do with the property. So if it's a field, you plant it. If it's a house, you live in it. If it's a parking lot, you park your cars there, or your wagons, whatever you were parking. So you use the property the normal way of using it for 3 years. And then once you do that, everybody knows that clearly you've been living on the property for 3 years. And therefore, you're no longer obligated to retain the documentation. And at the time of the Talmud, it was annoying to keep documentation because you had to keep it from the rats who would love to enjoy it. So therefore, once 3 years of normally living on the property passed, you were absolved from making sure the rats wouldn't get to your documents. Now we have an interesting problem that can result from this. What is it? So you have a lease, right? The Mashkanta Desura example, the Gemara calls it a borrower and a lender. The buyer of the lease, the farmer, is considered to be the lender. He's loaning money to the borrower. The borrower, which is the owner of the property, loans him his property in return for the money and gives him a certain amount of years to live on the property. Now, if he kicks him off the property before those years are up, then he has to pay. That means that the document here is for the farmer. He is considered the lender of the money, and he's not the owner of the property. Okay, so what does this mean? When we have the lender here has a document. Let's say the document says in it 5 years. There's a major risk factor now. He can live at the property for 3 years, do whatever he's supposed to do, and then claim the property belongs to him. So this is exactly the issue at hand in the Gemara. So let's see the Gemara. Okay. Malva Omer Chomesh. The lender here, the lender is the farmer, which is not the property owner, right? He loans money to the borrower. He is the owner of the property. Together? No? No. Basically, it's a redeemable lease. That's what's going on here. So let's say I have a lot of money. You have a field, right? I buy your field for $10,000 for 10 years. Now, this isn't really considered a purchase. It's considered a loan, right? Every year, your loan is reduced by $1,000. But you can recall the lease at any given point in time.
I'm the borrower and you're the...
So I loaned you money. You pay me by giving me your field with a certain rate of depreciating the loan.
There's so much lender, borrower, lender, owner, this and that. Like,
I get it. Okay, so in this case, I'm the lender. I am, in English, we call the lessee. I'm the farmer. Right? You are the owner. You're the borrower, and in English, the lessor. Make sense? Put together? Okay. So now we get into a fight. Okay, so here's the deal. Malva Eimer. Now, 1 second. Let's point out one more thing. Who has the documents? Me. Obviously. Why? Because I have a collection document. In case you make some fusses, then I will have a document to be able to force you to pay the rest of the loan. Right? You, on the other hand, don't have a document. What's the risk factor here? I use the property as if it was mine, and 3 years later, I say it is mine. And you have no document to prove that it isn't yours. You see the problem. Okay, so Malva Omer Chomesh. In this case, the lender, that would be the farmer, in English what we call the lessee. By the way, the difference here between this is not necessarily such a difference, but in this case, the lease payment is upfront, which is not like in common law. There are certain types of leases that are like that as well. before the Twin Towers was destroyed, it was going to a 99-year lease with an complete upfront payments. Okay. 1 second, hold on. Okay, Malva Omer Chamesh, the borrower says 5. Loiva Omer Sholosh, the lender says 5, the borrower says 3. Omer Le Aisel Chashtara. So the lender, the borrower, that would be Nachshon, says to me, Aisel Chashtara, Aisel Ishtara, bring your documents, let's prove that it was either 3 or 5. So Omer Le, I responded, Shtara Irkisli. I lost the document. How convenient, right? So Rabbi Yehudah says, Malva Neman, the lender is believed. That would be me, right? Why? Me, the lender, the farmer, the lessee. And the borrower, that would be the owner and the lessor, he would not be believed. Why? Because I could argue that I own the property because I've been living in it for 3 years. So believe me to say that I leased it for 5 years. Because if I wanted to lie, I would have had a better lie. If I was lying about the 5 years, I could have lied and said it was mine completely. Ravashi. So Republic says Ravashi. Don't they know of the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah? My time, a high star. Kivan de Lagavite. I'm sorry. Rabbi Zvid and Rabbi Vira disagree with the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. My time, a high star. Kivan de Lagavite koy mizvah zehirubei. They disagree with Rabbi Yehudah here. Why? Because they say, look, the lender here has every incentive to lie. That would be me. Why do I have an incentive to lie? Because I lived in the property for 3 years, I could claim it's mine. Therefore, you think the document is lost? Baloney. The document wasn't lost. I'm just making a convenient claim. So therefore, actually, we believe the borrower here until the lender produces the document, because we have tremendous suspicions about the lender.
The lender could have taken payment up front and then cut off the time as well, right?
Because the lender could be hiding the documents, claiming it was lost.
Like he already has the money that he would have for the 5 years because it's paid up front, right?
No, to the contrary, the lender made the payment to the borrower, right? The concern here is that the lender could say the property is his forever. He has every incentive to do so because he's been living on the property for 3 years. So why wouldn't he say it's his? So therefore, to the extent that he admits that he's a lender, that he's not a permanent owner, then we don't believe him until he produces the documents. Because there's a deep suspicion here that he's lying about the document. He is the one who has the proof here. He should be keeping the document because he doesn't actually own the property. So therefore, we actually don't believe him here. Even though there's this argument of Migo, had he wanted to lie, he could have said he owned it. But now that he didn't, now that he said that he rented it, he has the burden of producing the document. Yeah? Okay. So now we go back to Rabbi Yehudah. Rabbi Yehudah says he is believed. So now the Gemara says, 1 second, then this type of relationship of this lease that we've been discussing, it's deeply problematic because it can always result, according to Rabbi Yehudah, in this fraudulent claim that the lender claims he's actually the owner. So Amar Ravina Ravina says Ravashi Elamiata Hai Mashkanta Desura de Kasvi Hachi. Every Mashkanta Desura that has this deal, the Mishnah Shani Ilan Tepik double Kesef, that after 10 years you give back the property, comes back to goes back to Nachshon, the original owner, and Nachshon is not obligated to pay me any money for my loan. One second, how could the rabbis create such a problematic relationship? Because in effect, the incentive structure here is for me to lie about my relationship with Nachshon. Instead of saying that I have a long-term lease with Nachshon, my incentive is to say, well, I actually own it. I bought it from him. Oh, and I lost the documents. You hear the issue. So Amalei Hasan Tekilah Rabbanan Dmei Ara Yov Tasko, Demor Ara Yov Taska Vikari Karya. Okay, this is what's done today in America with renters, right? You rent a property. Who pays property taxes? The owner. Similarly, the owner pays the property taxes on the property that the lender is living on. So therefore, we'll ask the lender for his property tax receipts. He's not going to have them because he hasn't been paying property taxes. and therefore the lender will know that the lender can't claim that it was purchased because he wasn't paying property tax or karikaria. These are sort of digging the ditches to make sure that the property drains well. Samar says, okay, well, that works if the property has ditches to drain, to be fixed, and taxes to pay. 1 second. Our less the car of Taska, but a property that doesn't have property tax and doesn't have ditches to drain, what do we do? So he says, you're right. In this context, we expect the owner, that would be the borrower, to make protests on a regular basis, to let people know that even though this guy is living on the property, he's only living on it as a long-term lease, not as a purchase. Gemara says, Loyim chamai. What happens if he doesn't make a protest? Gemara says, Ihud Avsan Avshay, he is the one who lost out because he didn't make the protest. So let me explain to you. I've said this story a few times. I'll say it again. It's a good example. My uncle is friends with a big Rosh Yeshiva, and this Rosh Yeshiva has a heart. He's known to have heart problems, very sensitive hearts. And he got into in his previous yeshiva, there was a major disagreement in the yeshiva about who should be the next Rosh Yeshiva. And it was eating at his heart, and his heart doctor basically told him, you better leave, otherwise you'll die from a heart attack. And that's what he did. He ran away, he left in the middle of the night, and he packed his bags and never went back. And my uncle basically gave him the house and to live in. The guy was homeless, and he never went back. Anyway, but he's still upset that he doesn't have the yeshiva, his first yeshiva. So every 3 years, I never Pesach, he makes a protest. And he gets together a bunch of people and he tells them, you should know that I don't relinquish my rights to that yeshiva that I potentially have. Just, my heart doctor won't let me, cardiologist won't let me pursue it, so I can't pursue it, but it's not like I've given up my claim. Nobody should think otherwise. So that is sufficient for a protest. That's all he needs to do. He needs to call 3 people in on an hour Pesach once every 3 years and tell them, you should know, I protest that this guy is sitting on my field. He should know he's only sitting on it as a long-term lease. He does not own the field. Okay. Oris Aimer Lemechsi Rati, Balabayas Aimer Leshlisha Rati. Okay, the sharecropper says, I've agreed to sharecrop at a rate of 50%. And the owner says, no, sorry, there's 33 1/3. There's a third. Hayrati. Mi Neman, who's believed? Rabbi Yehudah says, Balabayas Neman, the owner is believed. Rav Nachman says, Hakol committing Hamadina. Everything is like the custom. Savramino, the Gemara thought there's no debate here. Loi pligi. Haba asr the shakal risa paga. Haba asr the shakal risa tilsa. It depends on the location. In a place where it gets half, that's why the first opinion of Yehudah. I'm sorry. In the place where it gets a third, Rav Yehudah says that the owner is believed to say a third because that's the custom of the local place. Haba asr the shakal risa tilsa a paga in a place of a fifth of half. Then we believe the sharecropper, and that would be the opinion of. Okay, just get cut out for a second. We believe the owner over the oris in this case, because the owner owns the property, and he has the ability to claim that the oris the sharecropper has no portion of it. He has no share because he's just a hired hand. So he can, technically speaking, if there's no document, he could get away with paying him salary, and because of that. We believe him to say that he's a sharecropper at a lower rate than the going rate. Okay, so now we have another interesting debate. What happens? A guy loans money, right? Reuven lends money to Shimon, and Shimon passes away, and Shimon's property is indebted to Reuven. Reuven is the lender. Now, there's a major debate going on here. Shimon's property was improved. The orphans say, we improved it. And the creditor says, no, it was your father that improved it. What's the difference? If it was his father that improved the property, so that's part of the lien. The lien is his father borrowed the money, his father improved the property, so the improved property is what his father owes the creditor. If, however, it was the orphans that improved the property, then the creditor must give a refund to the orphans for the percentage or the amount of their improvements. Because he's not entitled to collect the investment of the orphans, only entitled to collect the improvements and the principal of the father. Al-Mila Havi Raya, who's obligated to bring the proof? Rav Chanina says, very simple, who owns the property? The orphans. So therefore, the orphans, the presumption is with the orphans, and the creditor needs to bring the proof. It's the creditor's job to bring the proof. This elderly person said, this is what Rav Yechanan said, it's the orphan's job to bring the proof, the opposite. My time, but what's the reason? So let's explain. In this scenario, regardless of who actually is saying the truth, the property will be collected by the creditor. The question is, does the creditor have to give a refund or doesn't he have to give the refund? If the property wasn't going to be collected, the question is this included or not? So then we say, the property has the presumption of the owner of the property. But over here, that presumption is meaningless. Why? Because regardless of who actually made the improvements, the property is collected. So now the question is, does the creditor need to give a reimbursement check to the orphans? So now the question is, you're trying to collect now for the creditor. That's a different question. Who has to bring the proof then? The orphans have to bring the proof. You want the creditor to cut you a check? Prove that you made the improvements. Because the creditor certainly is entitled to the property. There's no question about it. The question is whether the orphans are entitled to the check, to the reimbursement. So it's the orphan's obligation to prove that they did the improvements. Amar Abayas. Abayas says, Afanana mitino. We have a Bryce that makes the same points. Okay. Without going into too much detail, but if you have a tree that's too close to the main roads, so the people of the town can chop down the tree. Now it depends. If the tree, I'm sorry?
They've never been to Portland.
Yeah. If the tree was there and the owner had a tree there before the road was built, they have to reimburse him. If he planted the tree after the road was built, he had no business planting the tree and he does not get reimbursed. Okay, now let's say we don't know what happened. Well, the tree has to be cut down anyway, right? That's the law. The tree's been cut down. The question is, are you entitled to a check or not, to reimbursement? So you want to be entitled to reimbursement, prove that you're entitled to reimbursement. So the Bryce says similarly, self-exact The question is whether the tree came first or whether the road came first. They chopped down the tree and they don't have to pay. Alma keep the lemeket's kaimi, because the tree was set to be demolished anyway. Amrina le I see raya v'shokal hochanami high star keep the gavina kaimo command the gavi dami v'ali sem lahavi raya. Since the tree is going to be cut down, and if you want a reimbursement, it's your obligation to prove that you get the reimbursement. Similarly, because the property will be collected, if you want the reimbursement, you have to prove that you're entitled to the reimbursement. Okay, so what happened? I see some Yasmin Raya the Inu Ashbechu. So the orphans brought the proof that they improved the property. So Rav Chanina said that they're entitled to collect a portion of the property as their reimbursement. In other words, is their reimbursement cash or is it property? Or is it even up to the lender? Maybe it's up to the orphans. So the Gemara says, so Rav Chanina thought that they get property. They're entitled to get a portion of the property as the reimbursement. Meaning the creditor only takes the reimbursement minus the improvement. He collects the property, but minus a section that would be worth the value of the improvements. The Gemara says that is not correct. actually they get a monetary reimbursement because of the opinion of Rav Nachman. The Amr of Nachman over Shmuel. Nachman says in the name of Shmuel, Shlosh Yishamim Lahem, that's a shvach, u'mayla naisim b'dam. There are 3 people that get the value of the improvements, but they get it in cash. They get it in as a payment, not as a part of the property. And what are they? Bechor leposhet. Without getting too complicated, basically a bechor, a firstborn, gets a double portion. But let's say there was improvements post the father passing away. Those reimbursements are reimbursed. Those improvements that would happen after the father passed away are given back to the main collection pot to be redivided. How are they given back? By money. So they divide the property, the firstborn gets a double portion, but he has to reimburse all improvements in the property that happened after his father died. And that money goes back into the pot and it's divided among the kids equally. And the reason for this, like I've said many times, we'll get to it in just about 3 months, is 5 months, I'm sorry, is that a bechor does not take roy, only takes muhsik and not roy, and the difference between roy and muhsik is a very, very difficult gemara at the end of Bava Basra, and you'll get to it, when it's time. Okay, uksuba sisha, and similarly, a woman collecting her ksuba, same thing. She collects improved property, but she has to reimburse for the improvements. 1 second, I'm sorry. 1 second here. And a creditor to either orphans or a creditor when somebody bought the property from the borrower and made improvements. Same story. Amar Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina says to Ravashi, remember, do you mean to say that Yav Shvacha, that a creditor has to reimburse the buyer, the buyer who purchased the property from the borrower? The creditor collects the appreciation of the property. It's the responsibility of the borrower to reimburse the buyer. What happened was there was a lender to a borrower. The borrower sold the field to a buyer, right? The buyer made improvements. Says the Gemara, the creditor collects those improvements, and the buyer gets reimbursement not from the creditor, but from the borrower. If you'll say like if you'll say it depends what type of improvements we're talking about. Improvements that are about to be harvested, meaning the field was planted, it's about to be harvested. So that the creditor has to give reimbursements. Because look, the field is about to be harvested. You should have no right to take something that needs to grow on the ground for another week. That's considered as if it belongs to the buyer, not to the creditor. But the Gemara says that can't be. Actually, the creditor collects everything, even that type of benefit, where it only needs the property for another week. The Gemara says, "Like Kash, it's not difficult. The masik make a share hour shvacha. The loy masik make a share hour shvacha." Okay. If he's owed the value of the loan plus the improvements, then he collects the entire loan with the improvements as well. And if not, let's say that the loan with the improvements is $100,000, the loan is $50,000, the property with the improvements is now $100,000. So now he has to give the $50,000 reimbursements. So the Gemara says, like the scenario we explained, he's owed $50,000. The improved property is worth $100,000, so he has to give a $50,000 refund. However, you give cash. So the honey namely, you have a lisus, you have a maslek l'chamikul ara, hash l'asuzi, you have the gvira dara, baroi shir shafchoi. Basically, okay. Looks like we're finished. We'll have to finish this last line of Gemara tomorrow. Have a great day.